The cutting wind of the North Atlantic whips against wool sails. Beneath your feet, wood creaking. On the horizon, unknown land. It's not 1492. It's the year 1000. And these men aren't Spanish. They're Vikings. 5 centuries before Christopher Columbus touched American soil, Norse warriors had already set foot in the New World. They built houses, forged iron, confronted the natives. But the story was forgotten, buried under centuries of myth and silence, until archaeology brought the truth to light. Today, you're going to discover how the Vikings conquered America before any European dreamed of it. And get ready. This story will turn everything you learned in school upside down. Stay with me until the end. And discover the truth. To understand how the Vikings reached America, we need to go back to the 8th century. The Viking Age officially began in 793, when Norse warriors attacked the monastery of Lindisfarne in England. This event marked the beginning of 3 centuries of Scandinavian expansion that would change the map of Europe and the North Atlantic. The Vikings weren't just brutal raiders, as Hollywood likes to portray. They were extraordinary navigators, shrewd traders, resilient farmers, and tireless explorers. Coming from Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, they mastered revolutionary naval technology, the drakars and nars, long, flexible vessels that could sail both on the high seas and in shallow rivers. But what drove these men to leave their frozen lands? Several factors. Overpopulation in Scandinavia, limited arable land, fragmented political structures, and mainly, a culture that valued honor, adventure, and conquered wealth. For a young Norseman, dying in battle or exploring distant lands was more honorable than growing old peacefully. By the 9th century, the Vikings had already colonized the Shetland, Orkney, and Hebrides Islands. They founded Dublin in Ireland. They conquered parts of England, establishing the Danelaw. They navigated Russian rivers all the way to Constantinople. But the North Atlantic was calling. Around 870, a Norwegian named Ingolfur Arnarsson became the first permanent settler of Iceland. The island, discovered by lost navigators years before, offered virgin lands, pastures for cattle, and an abundance of fish. Within a few decades, Iceland was completely colonized by about 20,000 Scandinavians. And it was from Iceland that the next great journey would depart. A violent man, banished for murder, would sail even further west. His name was Eric the Red, and his discovery would open the path to America. Eric Thorvaldsson was born in Norway, but was exiled to Iceland after his father committed homicide. In Iceland, Eric repeated the pattern. He killed neighbors in land disputes and was banished for 3 years in 982. But instead of passively accepting exile, Eric decided to investigate rumors about lands sighted to the west. He sailed for days through treacherous seas, facing icebergs and storms. Then, it appeared before him, an immense coast, covered with ice in the interior, but with green and fertile fjords on the coastline. Eric spent 3 years exploring this land, mapping its coasts, identifying locations for settlements. When he returned to Iceland, he baptized his discovery with a strategic name, Greenland, a brilliant marketing trick to attract settlers. It worked. In 985, Eric led a fleet of 25 ships loaded with families, cattle, tools, and supplies. Only 14 vessels completed the crossing, but it was enough. They established 2 main settlements, the eastern and western. At its peak, the Norse population in Greenland reached about 5,000 people. But Greenland was only the penultimate step. The final destination was even further west, and it would be discovered purely by accident. It was the year 985 or 986. An Icelandic merchant named Bjarni Herjolfsson was preparing to visit his father in Iceland, as he did annually. But when he arrived, he discovered that his father had departed with Eric the Red to Greenland. Bjarni, stubborn and loyal, decided to follow him there, even without maps or knowledge of the route. Viking navigation didn't depend on compasses or sextants. They used the sun, the stars, the behavior of waves, the color of the water, the flight of birds, and even special crystals called sunstones, probably calcite or cordierite, that polarized light and allowed them to locate the sun even with cloudy skies. But Bjarni encountered something no technique predicted: a savage storm followed by days of dense fog. When the fog finally lifted, he sighted land. But it wasn't the Greenland he knew from descriptions. It was a low coast, covered with dense forests. His crew wanted to disembark, explore, perhaps claim the land. Bjarni refused. He was focused on finding his father. He sailed north, sighting 2 more landmasses, one mountainous and another flat. Finally, he turned east and reached Greenland. Bjarni was criticized for his lack of curiosity, but his descriptions circulated through the halls of Greenland, and a young man listened with special attention. His name was Leif Erikson, and he wouldn't make the same mistake. Leif was the son of Eric the Red. He grew up in Greenland, but had an explorer's spirit. Around the year 1000, he bought Bjarni's ship and assembled a crew of 35 men. He would sail west, following the routes described by the merchant, but this time, he would go ashore. The first stop was the northernmost land Bjarni had seen, a barren region, covered with flat rocks and glaciers. Leif named it Helluland, land of flat stones. Modern archaeologists believe it to be Baffin Island in present-day Canada. They continued south. They found a coast with white beaches and dense forests. Leif called it Markland, land of forests. Probably Labrador. But it was the third stop that would change everything. They sailed further south until they found a region with surprisingly temperate climate, rivers full of salmon, green pastures, and something that deeply impressed the Norse: wild grapevines. For Scandinavians accustomed to brutal climates, that was paradise. Leif called it Vinland, land of wine. But where exactly was Vinland? This mystery would torment historians for almost 1,000 years. For centuries, the story of the Viking arrival in America was considered legend. The Icelandic sagas that described Vinland were treated as mythology, exaggerated stories told around bonfires. Academics dismissed the narratives as Norse fantasies. But in 1960, everything changed. A couple of Norwegian archaeologists, Helga and Anne Stein Ingstad, desperately searched for physical evidence of Vinland. They traveled throughout the east coast of North America, from Rhode Island to Labrador, investigating rumors, examining dubious artifacts, following false leads. Then, at the northern tip of Newfoundland and Canada, in a place called L'Anse aux Meadows, a local fisherman named George Decker showed them some grass-covered mounds near the coast. It looked like nothing, but Helga's trained eyes recognized construction patterns. They were building foundations. Excavations began in 1961 and continued for years. What they discovered was incontestable: a complete Norse settlement, carbon-14 dated around the year 1000. They weren't native structures. They weren't later colonial. They were unequivocally Viking. The site contained 8 structures: 3 large halls, a forge, 4 smaller workshops, and a storage facility. The walls were made of turf over wooden structures, identical to constructions in Greenland and Iceland. They recovered more than 8,000 artifacts: forged iron nails, a whetstone, bone needles, a bronze cloakpin, a soapstone lamp, and crucially, evidence of iron production. The forge was particularly significant. The native peoples of North America didn't produce smelted iron. This technology was exclusively European. Chemical analyses of slag residues confirmed Norse techniques. Additionally, they found remains of worked wood from species that didn't exist locally, suggesting the Vikings brought materials or traded with areas further south. Charred seeds included plants from the Old World. The discovery was revolutionary. In 1978, L'Anse aux Meadows was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site. For the first time, there was irrefutable physical proof. Europeans had set foot in America 500 years before Columbus. But L'Anse aux Meadows raises as many questions as it answers. The settlement was small, accommodating perhaps 70 to 90 people. There were no signs of prolonged occupation, just a few seasons, maybe 3 to 10 years. There were no graves, suggesting planned abandonment, not disaster. More intriguing, Lonso Meadows probably isn't Vinland. The saga descriptions mention abundant wild grapes. Newfoundland is too far north for native grapevines. So where was Vinland? And why did the Vikings abandon everything? The main sources about Vinland are two Icelandic sagas written in the 13th century, 200 years after the events. The saga of Eric the Red and the saga of the Greenlanders. Although they contain discrepancies, both agree on crucial points. Multiple expeditions were made to Vinland. Temporary settlements were established, and encounters with native peoples became violent. The Norse called the natives Skraelings, a pejorative term meaning something like savages or weaklings. We don't know for sure which peoples they were. They could be ancestors of the Inuit, the Mi'kmaq, or the extinct peoples of the Dorset culture. But we know the encounters weren't peaceful. The saga of the Greenlanders describes the expedition of Thorfinn Karlsefni, a wealthy Icelandic merchant who, around 1007 to 1010, led the largest attempt at permanent colonization of Vinland. He departed with 3 ships, about 160 people, including women and cattle. The intention was clear: to establish a permanent colony. Initially, they encountered the Skraelings and attempted trade. The natives offered furs in exchange for red cloth and milk. But tension grew. A Viking bull frightened the natives, who fled. Weeks later, they returned in greater numbers, armed. The saga describes fierce battles. The Skraelings used slings that launched dark and noisy projectiles, possibly stones tied to inflated animal bladders, which made frightening sounds as they flew. The Vikings, despite their warrior reputation, were outnumbered and geographically isolated. A fascinating figure emerges from these sagas: Freydis Eriksdottir, daughter of Eric the Red, half-sister of Leif. Pregnant during one of the expeditions, Freydis picked up the sword of a dead Viking and, beating it against her bare chest, drove away the attacking Skraelings with her ferocity. Another, darker version describes her murdering Viking women with an axe over resource disputes. These stories reveal the harshness of the colonization attempt. Despite abundant natural resources, native hostility, extreme isolation from Greenland, several weeks' navigation, and lack of sustained support made Vinland unsustainable. Around 1015, the expeditions ceased. The Vikings never returned to attempt permanent colonization. Vinland became just a memory, preserved in the sagas, waiting centuries to be rediscovered. But one question remains: did the Vikings explore more than Lonso Meadows reveals? Recent evidence suggests yes. Since the discovery of Lonso Meadows, archaeologists have searched for evidence of other Viking settlements in North America. And intriguing clues have emerged, though none as conclusive as Lonso Meadows. In 2015, space archaeologists from NASA, using infrared satellite imagery, identified geometric patterns at Point Rosie, also in Newfoundland, about 370 miles south of Lonso Meadows. Preliminary excavations found burned turf and a possible forge, but subsequent analyses were inconclusive, and many archaeologists remain skeptical. Norse coins have been found at native sites in Maine, but they probably arrived there through native trade networks centuries later, not indicating direct Viking presence. In 2021, a revolutionary dendrochronology study, tree ring dating, examined wood from Lonso Meadows that had been cut with metal tools. Analyzing the last growth ring, they determined that the trees were cut exactly in 1021. This is the most precise date ever established for Viking presence in America, exactly 1,000 years before the study's publication. But perhaps the most intriguing evidence comes from later historical texts. Icelandic ecclesiastical records from 1321 mention a bishop being sent to Vinland. Greenlandic records from the 14th century mention timber-gathering voyages to Markland. These documents suggest that although colonization failed, occasional resource-gathering expeditions continued for 300 years. This makes sense. Greenland was poor in quality timber, essential for shipbuilding and repairs. Markland offered abundant timber. Summer expeditions to cut and transport timber would be economically viable, even without permanent colonization. As for Vinland proper, the exact location remains debated. Many archaeologists believe it was further south, possibly in New Brunswick, where wild grapevines grow naturally. Lonso Meadows may have been just an outpost, a support base for explorations further south. But what ended the Viking presence in America? The answer lies in the collapse of Greenland itself. During the 14th century, the global climate cooled in what's called the Little Ice Age. Navigation routes became more dangerous. The Greenlandic colony, already isolated, went into decline. Trade with Europe diminished. The population fell. Around 1450, when Europeans finally returned to Greenland, the Norse settlements were abandoned. The connection to Vinland and Markland had been completely lost. The memory of Viking America survived only in the sagas, considered myths until archaeology proved their truth. So, did the Vikings really reach America 500 years before Columbus? Absolutely, yes. The archaeology is irrefutable. Lonso Meadows exists. Leif Erikson set foot on American soil around the year 1000. Thorfinn Karlsefni attempted colonization around 1010. Vikings cut timber in North America until at least the 14th century. But why does this matter? Why was this story forgotten for so long? First, the Vikings never achieved permanent colonization. Their settlements were small, temporary, focused on resource extraction, not territorial transformation. There was no significant cultural fusion, no documented miscegenation, no lasting impact on the Americas. Second, the knowledge didn't spread. The sagas were written in Old Norse, circulating only in Iceland and Scandinavia. When Columbus sailed in 1492, he had no idea that Norsemen had already crossed the Atlantic. His discovery was independent and had incomparably greater historical consequences. Third, context matters. Columbus's voyage opened the floodgates of permanent European colonization, the Columbian exchange of diseases, cultures, plants, and animals, systematic exploitation. The Vikings simply didn't have the resources, long-range naval technology, or institutional support to do the same. But recognizing the Viking arrival reminds us of something crucial. History is more complex than the simple narratives we learn in school. 1492 wasn't the discovery of America. Indigenous peoples had lived there for at least 15,000 years. Vikings arrived 5 centuries before Columbus. Possibly Polynesian sailors reached South America centuries earlier. The Viking story in America teaches us humility. It reminds us that great feats can be forgotten, that geography isn't destiny, that distant cultures can meet, conflict, and separate, leaving only traces for future archaeologists to unearth. Today, you can visit Lonso Meadows, walk through the turf foundations where Norse warriors slept 1,000 years ago, touch reconstructions of the halls where Leif Erikson planned explorations, feel the Atlantic wind that filled their wool sails. And if you enjoyed this story, if you were fascinated by how truth surpasses legend, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any videos. We have dozens of forgotten stories, buried truths, and historical mysteries waiting to be told. What story do you want to see next? Leave it in the comments. And share this video with someone who still thinks Columbus was the first European in America. Until the next discovery.